this video, we begin looking at an ancient writer's reflections upon the kingdom of heaven. This writer is not Jesus, and Jesus is not this writer, not even metaphorically. It is vital we keep this in mind. To a degree, I think, the church today roughly represents the ancient gospel writers, but I also think those same writers incorrectly represented Jesus by interjecting the supernatural. This video playlist helps one understand why I hold this opinion. I designate the gospel writers as G1, G2, G3, and G4, following the order in which they wrote. I do not use the biblical names Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These names were added by religion in subsequent centuries. The gospel writers all wrote anonymously. For now, remember that we are looking at kingdom stories, written by writers who depended upon oral scuttlebutt to write an escalating argument over who the person of Jesus is. Probably the most revealing bit of text concerning the presence of this argument among the early writers is found at the very beginning of the third anonymous gospel writer's work. The third gospel writer opens his work with, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you have been taught." So it's not hard to see the expressed attitude of this third gospel writer. He acknowledged there had been many writers. He and other writers were not eyewitnesses. What they thought they knew had been handed down to them. Then he said he was a qualified and careful investigator, and he was about to relate the chronological and exact truth. In this video, we are concentrating on one ancient writer, the only biblical writer to write the figure of speech, kingdom of heaven. He employed parables to make his point. In each parable, he begins with this figure of speech, kingdom of heaven. What is it like, or to what may it be compared? So let's look at the first three stories. The ancient writer introduces his concept by borrowing the first two stories from a gospel writer who wrote before him. Our kingdom of heaven writer, the anonymous writer I designate as G2, wrote, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares also among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprang up and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' And the slaves said to him, 'Do you want us to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, lest while you are gathering up the tares, you may root up the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" The writer begins with these statements of hope attributed to Jesus, but really does not address this hope at all. Instead, the writer offers a statement of despair. He describes sabotage, and then keeping the good and rejecting the bad, even burning the bad at the end of the parable. And as we will see in subsequent videos, Gospel Writer 2 does this in some fashion 6 times in these 11 stories. Now let's look at the earlier story from which Gospel Writer 2 borrowed. The anonymous writer I designate as G1 wrote, "And he, Jesus, was saying, the kingdom of God is like a man who casts seed upon the soil, and goes to bed at night, and gets up by day, and the seed sprouts up and grows. How he himself does not know. The soil produces crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, then the mature grain in the head. But when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come." The first gospel writer related a very simple story, also attributed to Jesus. A man plants seed, goes to bed every night, gets back up every day. He doesn't know how, but gradually it grows a crop. The man then reaps the harvest. Our Kingdom of Heaven writer, Gospel Writer 2, introduces statements of despair into Gospel Writer 1's otherwise simple story of the germination and maturation of seed, yielding a positive result. We will see this approach again attributed to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' message to the people of the way might have been nothing more than, "The way grows inside you. You may not see how, but the positive result is abundant." And as we will see later, the way is not supernatural. It's just one's attitude toward life. The second parable offered by Gospel Writer 2 was also borrowed from Gospel Writer 1. It's the well-known mustard seed comparison. Our Kingdom of Heaven writer, the anonymous writer I designate as G2, wrote, "The Kingdom of Heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all other seeds. But when it is full grown, it's larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." When Gospel Writer 2 borrowed this story from Gospel Writer 1, again both attributed to Jesus, it was not embellished. Let's look quickly at Gospel Writer 1's version of the story. The anonymous writer I designate as G1 wrote, "How shall we picture the kingdom of God, or by what parable shall we present it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the soil, though it is smaller than all the seeds that are upon the soil, yet when it is sown, grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants, and forms large branches, so that the birds of the air can nest under its shade." These first two parables follow each other in the first gospel, and they follow each other in our Kingdom of Heaven writer's work, the second gospel. One story our writer embellished, the other he did not. Then, when the third anonymous gospel writer wrote, he too borrowed the story. The anonymous writer I designate as G3 wrote, therefore he was saying, "What is the kingdom of God like? And to what shall I compare it? It is like a mustard seed, which a man took and threw into his own garden, and it grew and became a tree, and the birds of the air nested in its branches." There is nothing really new here. The third writer wrote much the same as the first two. Could the first writer, the earliest writer, have kept it so simple because it was so simple? Expanding upon Jesus' message to the people of the way, might it have been nothing more than, "The way grows inside you. You may not see how, but the positive result is abundant. The way grows until it is large enough to benefit others around you." At this point, the third writer attributes a parable to Jesus not found in the first writer's writings. Our Kingdom of Heaven writer, the anonymous writer I designate as G2, wrote, "The Kingdom of Heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of meal until it was all leavened." This parable also occurs in a later writing. The anonymous writer I designate as G3 wrote, and again he said, "To what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of meal until it was all leavened." As you can see, this story was borrowed by writer 3 word for word from our Kingdom of Heaven writer, Gospel Writer 2. You may have noticed I have not referred to the fourth anonymous Gospel writer, G4, at all. He wrote at the end of the 1st century and did not employ parables and sayings attributed to Jesus. He used a few allegories, but his obvious aim was to escalate the perception that Jesus was God. He even has Jesus saying so. The massive difference in the simplicity and humility of Jesus from the earliest gospel to the last highlights the ongoing escalation that was taking place to sell Christianity. If we accept the 11 Kingdom of Heaven parables as coming from Jesus and reject the threats the writer added, what might it sound like? What is the Kingdom of Heaven like? Following Jesus' simple line of thought, so far, it may be similar to this. The way grows inside you. You may not see how, but the positive result is abundant. The way grows until it is large enough to benefit others around you. It grows until it infects, like leaven, your friends and family. As we move on through the Kingdom of Heaven stories, we find they originate with our second writer, or perhaps there are other sources never included in the Bible. We will see our Kingdom of Heaven writer continue to introduce his message of supernatural disaster into an otherwise message of hope. I know I bow to the atheist when I assume nothing supernatural ever happens. I also know I bow to the Christian theist when I assume a man named Jesus developed a following, known as people of the way. If the supernatural never happens, his following could not have developed from supernatural displays. All four gospel writers wrote supernatural stories pertaining to Jesus. Did Jesus promote the supernatural during his life, or did the writers add the supernatural in order to promote Jesus after his death? The coming videos will continue to reflect my own studies and opinions, resulting from over a half-century of religious indoctrination, pastoring 4 churches, and a master's degree from the Mother Seminary of Southern Baptist. I named this video The Life and Times of a Great Idea. The life of Jesus' great idea was short-lived. The coming religious times would morph his great idea into a momentary, supernatural choice, requiring much less self-discipline. Jesus developed a following known as people of the way, but over the millenniums, billions instead flocked to a supernatural snap decision. As a result, few have this natural way about them today.